Hi, Joe.
Hello, Hamish. Good to meet you.
Nice to meet you too. Um, I thought a good way to kind of talk about some of your techniques and get into some other topics would be to talk about how they've changed over time. So maybe kind of compared to when you first started in the late 70s and 80s compared to now, maybe if we start with the drums, what was your kind of taste and go-to mic techniques and favorite mics back then, how they changed over time going up to now?
Well, I think techniques and taste do change over time. I think the real key to the question is that my approach is different for every project that I do. I might not use the same mics or same amount of mics or in the same position, given the project. For instance, we were just talking about the Morrissey album, which is a bigger rock sort of act. I probably use a lot of different microphones, and then I'm doing something that's a bit more folky, and I probably use a lot less microphones and a mono overhead and less room mics, and much tighter sound. So I don't know, if, the maybe in some ways the overall aesthetic has changed over time. If you think about, now we're in a culture that is used to big pop records, dance records. We've been sort of behind hip hop for the last 30 years. So the bottom end and the sort of danceability of the grooves is really important. So I think we make records now at this moment with a bigger sense of low end, more impact, more groove, a tighter groove. And if you look back in the 90s, things were a bit more aggressive and in your face and more mid-rangey perhaps in terms of the drums. And I think, you change more so with the project, with the music, but I also think that, you're influenced by the times that you create the music in.
Yeah, sure. Maybe if you could talk us through, for example, the Morrissey project you've just been doing, kind of some of the mics and techniques you've been using for that bigger rock sound.
This particular Morrissey record is indeed it's different for him. Definitely more sense of groove, more going on in the bottom end. I don't want to say it's a dance record; it's not by any means, but there's definitely a lot more awareness of building something up from the bottom that moves and it's got a life on the bottom and. There's probably more focus on keyboards, less of a sort of big chugging 70s rock record, if you would want to put it that way. It's much more straight ahead, sort of four on the floor on the bottom on a lot of tunes, and just much more sense of groove. To this record, certainly there's ballads and simple tunes that don't have that same approach, but definitely I would say overall it's a bit of a change up in sound, and it's something he wanted. He wanted the covers album that I just mentioned to you earlier. To have a different sound than the last album I did with him, and this new one will yet again have a little bit different approach to the sound. And this is wow, this is my fourth album I've done with him. So yeah, it's always a kind of a challenge to treat them all a little differently and give them all a bit of character. But usually the material is really what dictates that. Just. How energetic the songs are, how storytelling they are, how aggressive they are, that kind of thing.
Yeah. Could you maybe talk us through, in kind of specifics, how you've been miking the drums for this, kind of your go-to techniques for it?
Um, yeah, okay. Well, I guess my favorite all-time kick drum mic is a AKG D12. If I have the opportunity to use that, that's my always first choice. From there, I use Bayer 88s a lot, RE20s, whatever. Um, So I start there for the inside of the kick. On the outside of the kick, I'll usually have a larger diaphragm condenser. A 47 FET would be the first choice, but 87s and even 414s and a number of things work well. They used to get padded down, and that I'll put on the outside of the kick drum. If it's a mic, if it's a kick that has no opening in the head, I might even go so far as to take the front head off and mount a microphone inside the drum, or I'll mic the beater side as well as the resonance side. If I have a sub kick available, I'll like to have that available. I tend to, on most sessions, sort of over mic the drums, meaning I put a lot of mics up in the room and even on the kit, and then I kind of pick and choose depending on what the song asks for. So sometimes I might use just a mono 47 on the kit and a little bit of a snare mic and hi-hat mic, but perhaps no tom mics, no room mics for a tighter sound. Specifically on Morrissey record, some tunes were mic'd in that way, that they were basically tighter, dancier drum loop kind of things. So they might have had just a mono 47 overhead, a 57 on the snare, maybe something 441 on the bottom of the snare. Maybe a hi-hat, maybe no hi-hat, probably no tom mics. There'd be a smaller, tighter sound. The rock stuff would have tom mics 421s. It would have probably three mics on the snare drum. It would have a KM84 or 451 or Gefell 300 on the hi-hat. I'll often put mics, sort of lo-fi mics by the kit, something maybe down by the kick drum pedal, or perhaps something up by the beater side skin of the kick drum, and that stuff usually gets heavily processed, and they're just there for character. Just something to kind of hit the compressors with or the distortion devices with. Then I'll have, again, for a big rock thing, I might have a stereo ribbon mic right in the front of the kit. I might have a couple of closer mics, 3 to 5 feet back. Then I might have something, again, another pair of large condensers, 10, 15 feet back in the room. So it really does change up. Oftentimes I'll put one mono mic out in the middle of the room, and that's usually a sort of lower fi, mid-rangey condenser, maybe an old EV mic or a Shure or a Western Electric or something that's primarily just mid-range. I just kind of want the crack and the honk from it, and I sort of, just depending on the tune, will blend some of that in or not.
Can you think back to a session where you used the least amount of microphones on the drums that you ever have?
Oh, sure. Let's see. A few years ago, I did an album for a UK artist, Keaton Henson, and a lot of the drums were done in a small booth where there might have just been a D12 on the kick, 57 on the snare, and a 47 or 67 as a mono overhead. I did another artist by the name of Daniel Martin Moore, who's this beautiful voiced kind of folk singer. And we, same thing, drums were done in a very small, tight booth, and I almost think that it might have just been, because a lot of it was brushes, it might have just been like a mono overhead of 451 on the snare drum, and maybe like an RE20 inside the kick drum, depending on the song. But really, really simple, not a lot of processing. The overhead probably got a fair amount of 1176 type compression, but maybe even LA2A sometimes works great. But again, the music tends to dictate the sounds.
Yeah, of course. What's your favourite mic for Morrissey's voice?
Oh, for the most part for Morrissey, we use this last album. We used a old school Neumann U47. I would say one from the 50s or early 60s. Sometimes we've used a new Telefunken USA 47 on him. Um, we've also used the blue bottle mic with the 47 type capsule. I had good luck with that mic on his voice for many songs, certainly the ones that wanted to be brighter and more alive and more modern sounding, for lack of a better word. Um, the interesting thing about him vocally is that he's got a very big voice, and he tends to sing, sometimes 2 and 3 feet away from the microphone. It's not like your typical pop vocal. And when you get him close up on the mic, the extra low end, I don't know. It doesn't sound like Morrissey anymore. It just doesn't. It doesn't work. So I tend to let him, kind of choose the mic placement because he really has a good sense of that, and it will get treated very simply in the control room. It might be an LA2A or a Tube Tech CL1B. I've even used the Anthony DiMaria limiter on him. I've used a Retro 176 on him, and it's usually just a Neve 1073 mic preamp, usually flat. Maybe I'll use some Pultec EQ on him, but it's mostly tone control, just kind of top and bottom thing.
When working with an artist like that who's had a kind of long history of recording, when it's your first time recording them, do you kind of ask them if they have like a favourite mic or favourite techniques, or do you kind of just...
Yeah, pretty much any artist that I ever work with. I mean, nowadays everybody is familiar with the process so much. They all have their own studios that I always ask any artist that I work with, is there a particular mic that you love the way it sounds? Or, perhaps when you did your last album, did you like your vocal sound? And if so, what about it did you like? And, can we try to get similar mic and try that? It's about the singer delivering a great performance, and often, I've had it where a singer says, "Oh, I love singing on a whatever," and then I kind of sit there and go, "God, this doesn't really sound that great on it. It might be too bright or whatever." And but if they're performing well, it doesn't matter. I had something recently where um, the the um, the singer sounded just great on one of these new Chandler EMI microphones, and I loved it. I was actually quite surprised. It seemed to just deliver all the good parts of his voice. But at one point, he said, my last album, I used an M49, and it might be fun to just try that on a few songs. So we got a M49, an old one, and tried it. And I actually wasn't really crazy about it, but he was having such a good time singing on it. And I think the sort of compression that the tube gave him, and the sort of clarity that it didn't have versus the newer, more modern microphone, um, maybe was a little more forgiving, and he felt a little bit more confidence in his performance. So I was sort of like, yeah, if you're feeling good, just go, and I'll make up the differences in here. So it took adding a ton of tip top, and maybe I couldn't compress it as much as I could with other things, because it I don't know, got soft and small in the track, but he felt like he was performing better. So to me, that was half the battle, and I'd much rather win in terms of the performance. And like I say, you can always kind of improve the sound.
Yeah. Was that the Chandler Red mic or the newer TG one?
the Chandler red one. It's a big gray
Yeah,
thing with the preamp built into it. I'm not sure what it's called.
yeah, that's the red. Do you use that a lot in your studio?
No, I actually don't have one. The artist had one, and I've tried it before. I've tried it on other people, and I think it's a good sounding microphone. Very good sounding microphone. Actually, anything that Wade Chandler makes, Wade at Chandler makes is really really great. I have a lot of his stuff. The curve bender and the Zener and the germanium compressors, and I think he makes quality gear. And for me, it's about I like gear that has personality. That has a tone, that has a character, especially if you're doing, rock records, alternative records, jazz record, perhaps a different thing. But you want as much personality in the sound as you can get. To me, it's all about really, having a character and, sounding unique and sounding different than other people's records. So I tend to like gear that really, imparts a certain sound, or that you can kind of push it in a way that it delivers a character. So it's nice having your sort of favorite limiter or favorite EQ, whatever, but to me, it's more about just being able to deliver a tone. And there's some new manufacturers that are just building great gear. The Overstayer stuff, the Chandler stuff, the Cush Audio stuff. These are pieces of gear that just don't sound like any other gear, and I think that's important. I mean, the great old 1176s and LA2As and APIs and Neves, I use them every day and love them, but sometimes I like to get a little different character in things, especially, as we were talking about earlier, the sort of times that you live in really dictate the sound of the records. I need to make records that are unique for the artist, but competitive and sound like they belong in the time that they were made. Or I should say, they sound timeless. They don't have a real time stamp on it. I don't really. I think trying to make something that's deliberately retro, it limits yourself. So I like, if somebody says I want to make something that's a little bit more retro in terms of the sound, that's great. But I always want to find a way to perhaps, put in some elements that are a little bit more modern and some elements that are a little bit more retro. Again, I just think it's coming up with a character for every record that's different than the other, and I hope that all my albums don't sound the same. I think I'd be a failure as a record maker if every record I did sounded the same, even if it was great. I think that would be a disservice to the artists that I work with.
Kind of moving on from that blending kind of vintage inspired kind of lo-fi tones and hi-fi, more modern hi-fi stuff, I was going to ask about the White Stripes record, and if
Uh-huh.
you had any techniques for kind of blending those two worlds.
Well, it was interesting in that when I did that record, I had worked with Jack on some of his solo stuff prior to that, and I knew his aesthetic and knew how he liked to record, and had a good sense of him as an artist and as a producer. And when he called me about doing the White Stripes, I was excited because I was a fan of the band, and thought it would be great to do this. And I thought about it a lot, and I thought, this is really great. This two piece, this will be my time to do something that is a bit more honest, a bit more retro, a bit more classic. It's only two instruments. Let me do something that's like Glyn Johns sort of mic technique, that's kind of 70s approach to recording guitars, meaning large diaphragm, condenser a foot or two off the mic, off the cone, and not tight mic everything and not process things and basically, do something that in my mind was a little bit more timeless and a little bit more honest, because I felt like, wow, it's just only two instruments. I don't have to worry about things cutting through the speakers. That I did not have to shave space off of things to make them fit in. So maybe I can do something that's a little bit more honest in the approach. And I started out that way, and it was clear to me that after an hour or two of trying to get sounds, that it was boring. It just didn't have any sense of bigness, any sense of life and power. And if I thought about other records that were being made at the time, be it Queens of Stone Age or whatever, I was like, this won't fit in. This will be boring sounding. And I instantly said to Jack, hey, I got to rethink my whole approach to recording this. Will you just give me like 20 minutes, half hour? I want to just try a different approach to miking the drums. So I almost went the opposite in that, I went from 3 or 4 microphones to 14 microphones. And, I went from 2 microphones on the guitar amps to 6 microphones. And I went from no compression to heavy compression. And, I brought out things like the DBX subharmonic synthesizer and printed, bass generated harmonics on the kick drum when we recorded, and printed it to tape, because that was all done on 16-track analog tape. So there were no Pro Tools, no plugins, everything, all the sounds had to be gotten right there on the tracking date, very much, old school analog recording style. And so I had to sort of really quickly take a whole look at what I was doing, reassess it, and go someplace else. And I think that it ended up making for a much more interesting record. I think it would have been fine the other way. I think Jack had just come from doing Get Behind Me, Satan, and then Elephant before that he did at Toe Rag in London. And, those were a little bit more honest records that were, mic'd with a bunch of Coles ribbons and simple techniques. But I don't know. It just felt like, I don't know, been there, done that, if you will. Just I've heard this before. It's just not unique sounding. So I really scrambled and sort of took a different approach.
So moving on from that to other instruments, I guess of course it varies a lot with the band and the guitar sound, but do you have any kind of go-to or starting electric guitar mics, techniques?
Yeah, sure. Again, it depends on the sound that you're going for. Sometimes, just the 87 or KM84, 6 inches to a foot off the cone is great for what's called for in the part. But other times, if it's a bigger rock thing with a 4x12 cabinet, I'll use more microphones. Usually, I always end up with a ribbon and a dynamic, some combination of those two. Then I'll have another mic out in the room, perhaps maybe, I don't know, 3-5 feet away. And then if I'm doing, solos or ambient parts, I might have something that's 10-12 feet away and high up. But the combination of the ribbon and the dynamic seems to be a kind of winner for me, because one supplies what the other is missing. If I think back in the 90s when things were more guitar oriented and you had to get the biggest guitar sound ever, a guitar had to take up 50% of the record, if not more. it was about, a 57, a 421, 414, and then an 87 back in the room, and you'd be blending together different amps and two or three amps, and just different style. And again, it's kind of what the world was asking for in terms of tones at the time. It's almost like every artist was competing with the other artist in terms of like who could get the biggest, most in-your-face guitar sound.
Speaking of all that, I wanted to ask about some of the records the Frank Zappa records that you worked on in the 80s. Obviously, a lot of those records are very kind of guitar-centric. Was there anything differently that was done in terms of recording and mixing for a kind of guitar-centric album rather than a vocal-centric album?
Well, the Frank Zappa stuff is interesting in that Frank was pretty much a genius and pretty unique, and that's the thing with most guitar players and most musicians, period, is that the sound is in their hands. It's not in the microphones. And the way to get a Frank Zappa guitar sound, if you will, is to get Frank Zappa to play it. And the way to get something to sound like Jack White is for Jack to play it. And, every guitar player has such a unique approach to the instrument. And it's just like a drum in that depending on how much you press down on the string and how quickly you release the note, it really, really determines the sound and how hard of a concussive attack you have on the string or not. All those things play into the tone. So when you talk about great guitar sounds, I mean, it's really, truly in the player. Specifically with Frank, the setup was pretty complicated because he was a great experimenter, loved to try new sounds, just constantly searching for different sounds. His main setup would have actually been pretty involved because he actually had racks of gear. He had Eventide harmonizers and Marshall time modulators and ADA flangers and gain brains and custom built preamps, and he had quite a complicated setup of gear, something very untypical of the guitar players of that time. Early 80s, everybody either would have been using Marshalls or a Roland Jazz Chorus, or perhaps the studio players would have been using Fender Deluxes or Princetons, maybe. So Frank's setup was pretty deeply involved. In fact, it was really four amplifiers, for the most part, were engaged on almost every part of a Frank Zappa album. He usually had a stereo setup, and it was two channels that delivered a very clean tone. And sometimes the clean tone might have a flanger or some kind of effect on it, a delay. And then there'd be two channels of dirty guitar that might have been, through Marshalls or something heavier. And I remember I would mic the clean guitar with 421s or maybe 57s, and the dirty guitars were RE20s, and it'd probably be like an 87 or something in the middle of the room as well. And sometimes I might just use one of those cabinets. Sometimes I might take all four of them, combine them to mono. Other times we do things like use a little pig nose, 6-inch speaker guitar amp, and throw it in the bathroom or in the shower or even in the toilet, and just try to get something that was weird, or face it down on the floor, put it in the echo chamber. He used to love doing that kind of thing. So Frank was really great like that. I mean, it was always about really coming up with something different, and A lot of times we'd even try direct guitar, direct into the Harrison console. And I remember the Harrison consoles had these great parametric EQs that were very powerful and really had a lot of character. So guitar sounds were really manipulated at the console, and in fact, even a lot of times with direct guitars, I remember I would patch into one channel of the console, and then I would take that channel and send it to another channel on the console to get the EQ and all even more radical. And he loved these old Inovonics 201 compressors. So a lot of the direct guitars were done with those particular compressors. They're very sort of smooth compressors. And he also loved, we had a EMT PDM compressor, which was basically a Neumann mastering compressor. And a lot of times we'd use that on the guitar, and it could go from very subtle to very severe, just depending on how you hit it. And that got used on guitar. So his whole approach and technique was very different than most other guitar players at the time. Most other bands. When I think about it, it was kind of sort of new wave era, if you will, and most people would come in with a Roland jazz chorus that you'd put two 57s on, and or they might come in with just some small Fender. That was pretty much the typical guitar player's aesthetic, or unless you were in a kind of metal band. But yeah. I mean, I think ultimately, if you want to get a great vocal sound, you get a great singer.
Yeah.
You want to get a great guitar sound, it's just the real character comes from the player, and then the instrument.
Yeah. So I know some of those guitar records are recorded live in front of an audience as well. Other than the kind of obvious considerations, were there any huge differences recording and mixing a live album compared to studio album?
In some ways they were very similar because what happened was Frank decided that he really liked his soloing live as opposed to the studio. He felt that he kind of stiffened up. He got a little conservative when he got in the studio to record. So he tended to love what he was doing live. He'd, have board recordings that he thought the guitars were great on. And I said to him one day, why don't you just mic up the guitar and record it separately? Just get a 2-track machine and just record your guitar. And he did. And often, like the Shut Up and Play Your Guitar album, was really a lot of these recordings that were done live, where we would just take his isolated guitar track and basically have the band overdub to it. He had the greatest of musicians from, Terry Bozzio and Vinnie Colaiuta, who had just incredible time and just great feel, so they could easily kind of, after the fact, go back and play against Frank's guitar part, and it would just sound natural.
So I guess moving back to the instruments, maybe moving on to acoustic guitar,
Sure.
Do you have kind of go-to techniques, favorite mics?
Acoustic guitar, again, changes day to day, part to part. If it's a singer-songwriter type of situation where I'm trying to make the guitar sound big and equal to the voice, I probably would do a 2-mic kind of setup, where there's a mic that's sort of on the 12th fret and then a mic that's closer to the bridge. And I might do a small body condenser on the bridge, like a 451 or a KM84. And then on the neck, it changes daily depending on the sound. If I want something more sparkly and bright, I could use a blue bottle or a 414. If I want something that's warmer, more musical, I'll use like a Sony C37A tube mic, or maybe a 67 or 251, depending on what the studio has. If I'm doing just a strummy guitar that's part of the rhythm, I think I have to ask myself, what do I want out of that guitar? Do I want just the pick across the strings percussion, or do I need the tone, or do I need the weight and the body? So the miking really is determined by what I'm trying to get out of the sound. I've done everything from Cole's 4038s to a 57. I used 57s and RE15s, EV RE15s. I love those mics. They're just very mid-rangey. You don't get a lot of that zippy, strummy thing. So they can be kind of nice and middly sounding in a track. Often, if I'm double tracking an acoustic guitar, I'll treat the second track with a different microphone. If I'm double tracking, usually I like to get excuse me, a little different tone of some sorts by either changing the guitar, changing the inversion, capoing. But often I'll just change the mic setup, or just deliberately change the EQ or compression.
Yeah. Do you have kind of go-to techniques for if someone is playing the guitar at the same time as singing?
I've done a lot of things with that, and it really depends on the singer. If it's somebody that's kind of confident with their playing, and I really need to get isolation, I've almost built baffles or blankets over their guitar. So I've tried to figure out ways to separate the voice and guitar. I mean, the toughest thing is if you have somebody that's playing acoustic guitar quietly but singing loudly. It's almost impossible to not get the guitar to bleed into the acoustic guitar mics. A lot of times, if I can, I'll take a direct out of the guitar, and I'll even put a pickup in it. And even if that direct sound only ends up being 20% of the acoustic guitar sound, it's 20% less vocal leakage in the microphones. So all you can do is try to point the microphones downwards a little bit away from the voice, and try to point the vocal microphone a little bit upwards, so the back of the microphone is facing the acoustic guitar, to get a little less guitar in there. But it's definitely tricky, and sometimes you just have to you just have to deal. And when it gets to be a problem, in other words, perhaps somebody sings the chorus really loudly, and there's so much vocal in the acoustic guitar mics, it's making the voice sound distant, or you can't bring the acoustic guitar up to the level that you need to. I'll ask them to, maybe move their head a little bit to one side or the other, to the left perhaps, to, avoid singing into the guitar microphones. So, but that's definitely a tricky one, and it's really just luck, I'm trying to think, there's a couple of singer-songwriters that I've done albums with that I've been very fortunate to, like Jason Mraz, who's got a stunning voice and is a great guitar player, and his voice is about the same level as his acoustic guitar playing. So it's easy and perfect. Jamie Lawson, who I did an album with a couple of years ago, Jamie's just great player, and he really wanted acoustic guitar sounds that were smaller and a little bit more fragile. So we went out and found a bunch of small body parlor type guitars that had much more mid-range tone, and a lot of the miking might have been done with a 421 or an RE15 that I mentioned earlier. I think it's really it's down to the singer.
So I guess carrying on to talk about separation and bleed, I do a lot of my recording in one big room. Have you had
Uh-huh.
any particular kind of technique success over the years with controlling bleed or working with it, or can you think of any kind of particular projects where you've had to do a lot of that?
Yeah, I mean, the bleed thing can be absolutely great. It can be really powerful. If you think of all the great jazz recordings done at CBS 30th Street Studio in the 1950s, or Rudy Van Gelder recordings done in the 50s and 60s. I think part of the tone of those records is the leakage. It's the piano and upright bass sitting right next to the drums. So the drum leakage that's there is all tight early reflection. It's not leakage from across the room that's, 5 milliseconds delayed. It's super tight. So it tends to be thick sounding, and it almost reinforces the tone. Sometimes a lot of the kick drum bleed from a jazz drummer's kick drum that you get in the piano can just have this nice resonant bottom, and it really adds to the kick drum. So leakage can kind of really be your friend. I've done things like, for instance, I did some of the solo Jack White stuff I did. We did with everybody standing in a circle, and a small drum kit there as well, and we had a couple of acoustic guitars, upright bass, and whatever leakage is there, you just kind of balance it, get everybody in balance, and you do it if you have to, really really old fashioned style, where if somebody is too loud, you get them to turn down a little bit, or you get them to move away from the mic, and you really can come up with some great tones. And hearing the room and feeling a sense of people in a space, that's a wonderful thing. So I'm never really that nervous about the leakage. The only time I'm nervous about it is, perhaps if I know there's a player that's really not confident, and I may have to overdub his part, and then I want to make sure that that's not kind of getting in mics that I don't want it to. But I think the leakage, a lot of the U2 records were always done with monitors on the floor, and that extra booming bottom end that comes across everywhere just gives it this rich tone.
So, have there been any particular rooms over the years that you've had to record in where you've had to kind of change your techniques a lot to make the room work, either kind of very, very live rooms or odd reflections or very dead rooms?
Actually, yeah, I'm just thinking of something very recently where I was tracking, and the room was reasonably uh, good size, but it was dead, and it just didn't have a tone. It sounded very boxy. Um, I was kind of fighting it from the start. And what I ended up doing is reducing the amount of microphones that I used on the drum kit, going for a tighter sound, relying less on the room, because even though I was able to put up distant mics, the distant mics just sounded like the same room tone but delayed. They were starting to get slappy, and they really weren't adding any additional tone or color. They were just adding a delay to the drum kit. So I, in most cases, had to just scrap those mics and go with something that was just a couple of feet in front of the kit, like I think I had a pair of Coles 4038s that got compressed heavily with a SSL compressor, and the room tone on the drums was really all about tight early reflections, and the compression. brought up the kind of extra resonance in the drums and gave it a little bit more character. But yeah, I mean, I had to sort of fight the room because the more I tried to use it, the less tone I got. I just got this boxy, delayed sound. So I would shy away from the room mics and go from a stereo drum setup to a mono mic and bring the mic down lower and deliberately get less of the room. And that becomes the sound of the record, and that gives the record an identity. Maybe it's not the identity that I started out with desiring, but you kind of adapt and you make it work, and it really becomes part of the character. So then you have to, if you need more ambient tones or bigger tones, you've got to look at overdubbing things that will deliver that kind of character. So I think you kind of deal, and the sometimes the limitations can become the strength of the record.
Are there any techniques that you've had to use in odd situations that you kind of never imagined working, but actually works quite well?
Yeah, let me think of a couple of things. I mean, I've told the story before of Jack White's vocals. When we did the White Stripes stuff, Jack really wanted vocals that were kind of hot and aggressive and had kind of great sort of distortion on it. And no matter what I did, overdriving a 1073 or overdriving the output of an LA2A or any kind of a distortion device, I couldn't get the distortion right for him. It was not. It was distorted. It had power and energy, but it wasn't fun for him to perform with that tone because the distortion was kind of always there. It wasn't dynamic with his performance. So I came up with a setup of miking him with an RCA 77 microphone, which is bidirectional ribbon, and I also put up a 57 microphone, a Shure 57, right next to the ribbon, and fed the 57 into a guitar amp and put the guitar amp right in back of the RCA. So he basically was singing into the RCA and the 57 simultaneously, but the 57 was feeding this guitar amp. And, it being loud and dynamic, he was able to sort of move into the 57 when he wanted more distortion, and all that amped up vocal from the guitar amp would come into the back of the RCA 77 and blend in with the dry vocal that was coming in from the front of the RCA 77, and just worked out great. So he was able to distort the mic how and when he wanted to. It was almost like he, had a distortion device or a plug-in in his hand while he was tracking.
Are there any kind of experimental techniques like that you've tried that just kind of basically completely failed and you're never going to try again?
Oh, I don't know. Usually, the interesting thing about failure is it sometimes means that the technique is not a failure. It's the moment, it's the application that's the failure. And sometimes if you use that same technique on a different project with a different artist, it works great. And I think that part of the trick is, kind of hearing a sound, capturing it in your head, and being sort of aware of what the process and technique was to get that sound, and then cataloging it. So somewhere down the line, when you're looking for something else or you're in a bind and you can't really get the tone that you want, that's there on the shelf for you to use. For instance, with Keaton Henson's vocal that I mentioned earlier, Keaton sings very quietly. It's just a whisper, and it's got all this beautiful crackly. It really sounds like somebody singing in your ear. It's just beautiful, but that's not easy to capture. And what I ended up doing was doing two microphones, a U67, which had a really nice full-bodied natural tone, wasn't compressed much at all. And then I put right next to it an RE15, which is a real kind of mid-range honky microphone, and compressed the hell out of that. And I would blend the two of them together, so you kind of had this sense of fidelity with the 67, but you had this RE15 that captured every single nuance and detail of his vocal, because it had about 20 or 30 dB of compression on it. And then I would just blend the both of them together on one track. That was the sound when I recorded. And the good thing is that he got to hear that sound, and he would react. His performance would become affected by what the sound was. So yeah, I mean, I think that there's a lot of different techniques that sort of go every day. I mean, a lot of times if I double track a vocal, I'll deliberately change the microphone for the double. I'll use something perhaps that's lower fidelity for the double track, or maybe I'll use the same microphone, but I'll just heavily compress it where the main vocal wasn't compressed that much. Anything to sort of fill in the missing pieces, to supply what the original vocal didn't supply.
Maybe you want to talk about mixing a little bit.
Sure.
When it comes to EQ and compression, how do you decide? I mean, I'm sure it's partly just experience, but how do you decide whether to kind of process things on the individual tracks compared to like the drum bus or the final two bus at the end?
Well, it tends to be a combination of all. I mean, the one thing that I do differently is that I tend to really track with all my finished sounds in mind. In other words, I really kind of go for it when I'm cutting my tracks. I try to get the record as close to the finished record as possible. So my EQ compression is done while I'm tracking. I might even print a parallel drum bus while I'm tracking. I'm really trying to get the record to sound like a final mix on the day that I'm tracking. So I'm looking to get 80-90% of the way there when the musicians are in the room. So I'm really shaping things for that effect. So the mixing process then isn't about reinventing things. Certainly there are some times where I go, I don't know, I don't like that approach anymore, or it doesn't quite fit into the mix in the way I had hoped it would. I need to make it smaller or weirder or whatever. But I really tend to go for it while I'm cutting my tracks. So the mixing process is a lot easier. It's not as much sculpting as there might have been done on the tracking date. It's sometimes clearing out room for parts to speak, parallel compression on the vocal or drums, of course, but it's really not a sort of ground up build. It's really like touching up the final 20% of the record, if you will. And obviously, if I'm mixing somebody else's material, something that somebody else recorded, then I've got to adjust my technique. And I would try to get the sounds the way I wanted them from the original individual tracks first, and let the parallel stuff become an addition. In other words, I probably would want most of the tone coming from the close tracks, and then the parallel compression would supply an additional 20% or 40% of the tone, but really the sort of initial character and bigness would come from the tracks.
If you're kind of looking to get most of that finished sound when tracking, is your two bus pretty minimal then?
Yeah, my two bus. I mean, I try to keep my two bus in the analog world. I really kind of old school like that, and then I really like some tone and character there. So yeah, it's a couple of dB of compression, a couple of clicks, a click of bottom, a click of top kind of thing. It's not heavy. It's not, a compressor or a limiter or whatever. It's probably light. I prefer to keep a fair degree of the dynamics there. And again, it's just dictated by the music. If it's something that's more electronic sounding and wants to be tighter and squished and more constant in terms of the dynamics, the attack time might be faster and the amount of compression might be more. If it's something that wants to be a little bit more honest and dynamic, like I don't know, the folk duo that I was mentioning to you before, then it's going to be simpler. It'll be softer ratios and longer attack times.
I guess a final question just to finish up.
Of course.
If you're engineering something that you're also mixing and producing, how much does your kind of recording technique change if you're the person mixing it or if it's going off to someone else to mix?
Same thing. Like I said earlier, I kind of go for it. I really try to get the record as close to what I hear in my head when I start day one. In fact, to be really honest, I try to get the record as close to finished when I'm in the rehearsal room with the band. I'm there, kind of crafting arrangements that are going to sound like a finished record. I'm really thinking about how one instrument relates to the other and trying to get parts that work together but sound separate. So I'm kind of doing my mixing before I even enter the recording studio. I'm making sure that parts don't compete, that tones don't clash with other tones, that, I've got the, snare drum sitting in the right place and it doesn't fight the vocal and all that kind of stuff. I tend to think like the real art of making pop records, if you will, happens at the arrangement stage and not so much the recording or mixing. The more I feel like I'm prepared before I go in the studio, the better record I make. And that doesn't mean I'm not still going to experiment with different textures or odd characters, but the foundation, I guess, is my point here. The foundation of the record is sound because I've really got a sense of clarity and power worked out before I get in the studio.
Thank you so much for speaking with me.
Of course, yeah. I hope this works for you. It's been a pleasure.